Well, good evening, and I am incredibly excited. We have Rachel Gabriel here. She has her reputation precedes her, ILA board member, longtime researcher, uh, publishes in the Reading Research Quarterly, folks. That itself is an amazing accomplishment. So I'm going to turn things over to her now and ask her to tell us a little bit about herself. And after that, we'll have some questions. So, Rachel, tell us all about you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Long time listener, first time caller. Um, I'm a second generation reading specialist. My mom was a reading specialist in Brookline, Massachusetts in the early 80s, and she was reading recovery and Wilson trained. So she kind of had the spectrum, and at the tail end of her career, went back and did the literacy collaborative training too. So I get an earful at home and at work. About reading, and I taught in Washington D.C. in middle school, and left and really wanted to work with Dick Allington because his books were the books that were most helpful for me as a teacher. And so I emailed him and said, "Do you take doc students?" And he said yes, and the rest is basically history.
Wow.
So um, so I had the great honor of working with him down in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I studied reading policy, which is sort of an intersection that I learned from him, and one that he encouraged me to follow, and that's what I've been following. So I think we're going to talk about a few different angles of that tonight, but that's what I've been doing now at the University of Connecticut. This is the decade mark, which feels really strange, but
Wow.
there we go. It's the
That,
longest I've done anything, so it must be good.
well, it has to be good. So I'm going to go back to and start with the first question. It's just going to be an open-ended one. And I heard you mention reading recovery. So what's your opinion of all that? And um, any things to say about the whole issue of reading recovery? And my readers already know that I'm a recovery trained teacher and very much a spokesman and advocate for it. But so I like to put stuff like that up front. But what do you think of recovery and anything you care to say about it? Take
Yeah,
it over.
thanks. So if another kind of full disclosure, besides it being kind of in the family, I'm on the board of the Reading Recovery Council of North America right now, which is an honor because I get to work alongside people that understand early reading better than anybody else in the world. I learn something about reading every time I am in the room with somebody who's reading recovery trained. And one of the things that I really value and respect about that community, and one of the reasons that whenever there's a question I say yes. If I can hang out with them more and longer, the answer is yes. I love how they talk about children, and I love how they talk about teaching and how it's interesting, exciting intellectual work that they are committed to with their whole beings. I love that like complexity is interesting to them instead of annoying to them or scary to them. I love that they are always learning about their children, that they're sort of like they're the best researchers I know, but they have a very specific area of research, which is how does a first grader in front of me process text, process print, and how are they using language, what they know about language to do that. So I think the positioning of teachers as capable of thinking and making decisions, and the positioning of students as also capable of thinking and making decisions, and the fact that they are not yet demonstrating high-level literacy skills doesn't actually change the esteem that you have for them. You're still interested in how their minds work, and assume that their minds do work, that they're not broken, that they're not developed yet, that they're not, like there's nothing wrong with them at all. It's just an interesting, beautiful kind of tapestry of ways of engaging with language, and you're hoping to be part of guiding them to do it in more conventional and effective and optimized ways so they can do what they want to do as readers and writers. I think like for that alone, like for that positioning of educators and that way of thinking about children as learners, for that alone, I wouldn't have done a lot to to learn more from that community, and to imagine that they really have a good idea about what's going on. But also as just a researcher who's read a lot about reading intervention and done a lot of it myself. And I train reading specialists. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 years up at UConn. Reading recovery has a whole way of thinking about reading development that doesn't leave teachers alone when they are stuck. It gives them a playground, a theory to play with, to understand kind of what they're seeing. And that is no easy thing to do for an educator. Like, building that is really difficult to do. That's why it takes so long to get trained. It's not like a one weekend training. And also they have this network, which is the other place that I've gotten to connect with them, where if you're sitting across from a reading recovery teacher as a 6 or 7 year old kiddo, you're not just sitting across from them, you're sitting across from their whole group of teachers that are learning together, and the folks that came before them, and the folks that they work with across their networks, and people at universities and people in different countries. Like the Reading Recovery Network does a really great job of working as a network and staying together on things. And so I think, their stats are really good. We have a study out of the hundreds that suggests that the long-term impact is 0.2 standard deviations, like 1/5 of a standard deviation different than control kids. And that is not even really a meaningful difference when we think about like what could that mean in the number of questions. But on the other hand, we have other long-term studies that say it's significantly more successful than controls and every other thing. So I appreciate that people are paying attention to new research, and I appreciate how reading recovery doesn't just dismiss things that don't fit their narrative. They've like deeply engaged with this data. They've deeply engaged with the researcher. They are actively like trying to figure out exactly what it means and doesn't mean, and what it means for the training and what it means for support and all of that stuff. So I think they really do walk the walk and kind of model the ways of being in a research-driven profession. And the current thing is a blip. And I think I've said this a couple of different places, but like, this is the same researcher using the same data that Twitter kind of eviscerated a few years ago when he was reporting how successful reading recovery was in the short term. And now that the tune has changed a little bit when they're looking at the long-term studies, all of a sudden the data is perfect, and so is the analysis, and that just seems like so disingenuous. It's not even funny. Meanwhile, reading recovery took the same approach to the first data that was positive and the second data that was negative, and similar data in the UK that was positive. And so it just, if we want to know how to use research to get better, they are a pretty great example of how to do that over time. And for that reason, I trust that leadership, and I trust that example.
Okay. Well, I'm going to chime in. You tripped a couple of wires for me, personal wires, and that is, first of all, you're talking to someone that was reading recovery trained, and I'll tell you what.
Yeah, I knew I liked you, Dr.
Okay. I have a doctorate. I had to do all that. Was a sergeant in the Army, and I had to go through basic training and all that. But I'll tell you what, of all the training that I've ever done in my life, that was absolutely the most demanding and the most rigorous, bar none. It's also the one that was the most life-changing. And I have many reading recovery friends and reading recovery teachers who are friends, and all of us mark before and after our reading recovery training.
Yeah.
And so it's my career and my whole outlook is very different. So besides all the other good things you've just said, the training and the professional development that's done is amazing. And that's what my mantra for years and years and years has been: follow the child, fit the program to the child. And reading recovery does that, and that's what I love about it. Okay, so now I'm off of my soapbox. So I just had to, I had to say that. You guys really put us through the ringer. Oh, did I say that? I didn't really say that.
Yeah.
But it was worth it. It was totally worth it. Okay, so let's move into another thing, and thank you so much. You did some things for Missouri Literacy Association and a webinar and that kind of thing. And one of the topics you talked about was the weaponization of research. So could you briefly talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things, one of the first things that I learned about the intersection of reading research and policy. I've been studying policy, education policy, and reading all sort of the traditional books that you read for education policy studies. And on the other hand, doing my reading thing. But one of the first times that they intersected was around this idea that people use research to do a couple of different things, that research use has several divisions, and that these divisions were outlined maybe in the 70s, in the late 70s, and we've added a couple to them, but like, just because research said so doesn't mean doesn't mean it's true. And there's all these different versions of like how people deploy research as a rhetorical tool. And so I've been interested in discourse analysis for a really long time. And I sort of come by it honestly as a middle school English teacher, because when you teach persuasive writing, that's what you're doing. But the idea there is that there are maybe 7 different ways that people use research to accomplish things in conversations or in campaigns or in policy documents or in public service announcements. And only one or maybe 2 of them have to do with really engaging the existing findings of research. So sometimes people are just making their point by saying they're going to commission a study, they're going to get some research done on something, and that makes their point for them, and they've used research in that way. And in other cases, they just say, like, intone it, sort of like saying, and Jesus said, like they just attribute things to research as if and don't necessarily track those things down. So a colleague of mine, Emily Hodges, who's at Montclair State in New Jersey, we went through the Appendix A of the Common Core State Standards, which is their sort of the research brief on the research background for the standards. And we just went through the reference section, and we were super annoying about it. And every time there was a claim that had a citation after it, we followed up on that citation and asked ourselves, does the claim match the citation? And about 30% of the time, it sure did. And about 60-something% of the time, it was either sort of related, maybe like kind of related. It would cite a book that was about reading. It didn't quite say that statement that they made, but it, was in the neighborhood. But within that, the sort of 2/3 that were not really direct support, a good third of it was either citations that couldn't really be found, like maybe they were written wrong, or maybe they had not just the wrong year, because we gave people a lot of leeway, and switched in different years and tried the different names of publications in order to really find the articles that were being referenced. But either it was something that didn't exist, even when we emailed the authors, they couldn't put their finger on what those folks were talking about, or it was something that was really irrelevant, like this was a study of I don't know, corn seeds, and they were citing it as evidence of stages of reading development. So there's totally room for human error in putting your reference section together. Everybody knows that's tedious and annoying work. And so I don't imagine that anybody has a 100% perfect citation statement correlation, but 30% is pretty darn low. And I think it's a good indication that people are using the trappings of research, sort of saying like, here's a citation, here's backup for that. Science says, research isn't a person. It's not a thing. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't have a voice box. You give it voice, and you give it voice however you want. And people very rarely follow up to see where you got that from. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to be fact checking everybody else. I am saying that people use research to do things in their conversations, and it is much more a rhetorical tool than it is a set of answers. And part of that's because like research doesn't come up with the answers that we need for things most of the time. So we have to use it in these lots of different ways in order to make it relevant. But part of that, I think, is that even though there is suspicion about science and suspicion about truth and suspicion about expertise and suspicion about who these researchers are and what their if their findings are real or not, even though there is suspicion, we still as a culture fall for what people present as the science or the research. And therefore, it can be weaponized. It can be used to do things that there may or may not be evidence for, or that there could be evidence for if you take that evidence in isolation and don't put it in conversation with all the other sources of evidence that you could be using.
Wow. Okay. Um, I'm going to change topics on you one more time.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you have a couple of books out about uh, evaluating literacy instruction and making teacher evaluation work.
Mhm.
In my own background, my major hat has always been teacher. Okay,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
have taught, reading courses to teachers, and I currently do professional development for teachers. So I'm really interested in what your thoughts are about evaluating literacy instruction, and especially as someone that does professional development for teachers from time to time,
Mhm.
advice and counsel about how to do that effectively. So
Yeah,
I'm going to just turn things right back over to you.
sure. Thank you. Um, I've been interested in teacher evaluation and more so a decade ago when there were many new teacher evaluation policies, because I saw it as one of the many forces that set and limit what counts as good reading instruction, and therefore set and limit what opportunities kids have to learn to read. So I think around like right after Race to the Top, after 2009, for the next handful of years when states were coming up with new policies, there was a lot of activity and energy and time spent engaged in the work of evaluation, people coming in with rubrics and having post-observation conversations and pre-observation conversations and lots of forms. And because there was so much activity around it, it had, I think, an outsized influence on how people taught and therefore how children were able to learn in school settings. So that was my main reason for studying it closely, especially when it was, I think there was much more energy behind it probably 7 and 8 years ago than there is today. And I think that it takes up now a much more right-sized place. There should be evaluation, but it shouldn't be 100% of what a principal does. And there were some studies that at the height of this teacher evaluation craze, that 90% of their time was spent on evaluation related activities. And the other 10% was like, I don't know, ordering toilet paper for the building. They're like, what can you do with 10% of your time? It took up just a huge amount of space in educators' minds and in school leaders' minds, and it isn't the key lever that folks thought it might be in terms of helping teachers improve. Just giving feedback, first imagining that your feedback is the right feedback at the right moment is one big assumption, but also just the idea that feedback in itself, or the sort of vending machine model of professional development, where if you score low on this rubric row, here's your workshop, and you scored low on this rubric row, so here's your workshop. Those don't actually add up to better teaching. They just add up to a whole lot of contracts for vendors that do trainings and professional development workshops aligned to a rubric, which aren't as great as they could be. So if it's in its right place, if we're thinking about evaluating teachers in order to support and develop them, then I think probably what I learned by really studying the instruments that people use, the checklists and the rubrics and the protocols for observing instruction, is that simpler is better, and that we are not good as observers at being particularly fair about observing nuances, especially because we will read those nuances differently based on how well we know the classroom or how well we know the teacher and the context and all that stuff. So we don't have great reliability when we try to look at details. What we can look at are like the big broad strokes. And so I like to think of it as like, are kids reading, writing, and talking about what they read and write? Yes or no? And if not, why not? And the teacher needs feedback about that. And if they are, how could you support what the teacher is already actively trying to do, because that's likely to be sort of their own zone of proximal development and their own interest area and their own sort of the frontier that they're willing to push themselves on. See it, like looking for what are they doing to accomplish that, and how could they do it more or better or more efficiently, easily, smoothly, or for more of the kids in the room. So really, I think of it a lot more like kind of pulling clay, but like where like you have to put your hands exactly where it is and pull from there. We can't go in with like, good instruction is this. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. Now everybody should do this thing that I wrote down on a piece of paper. That doesn't work at all.
Okay. Remind me if you ever decide to change careers and become a principal to apply to your building.
Yeah, right.
Would you do that for me, please? Okay.
Mhm.
I think we're now at that point
Moral.
where, did I leave anything out? Is there anything more you'd like to say?
I
Uh,
don't think so. No, thank
okay.
you for having me.
Well,
It's a lot of fun
you've
to talk to you.
you've said quite a lot, and we so appreciate the many things you do for the field. Your clear-headedness in how you look at the research and explain it. For some of us, it's like, what? What's that? And you turn the what's that into something totally understandable. So I'd like to thank you for taking your time tonight to talk to us. And now there's one last tradition for a Bomberito interview, and that
Okay.
is the famous Zoom wave goodbye. So in just a moment, we're going to raise our hands and say goodbye. So Zoom wave goodbye, and we'll wrap this up. Bye. Zoom wave, and here we go. And now we're going to stop this.